Perhaps I'll quickly go down the panel and, without necessarily wanting to force you to put precise numbers on it, but let's look out a good long time. Let's look out 30 years then, and say in that time, in 2040 or so, how does the energy mix look, and what are the kind of maybe even the rough proportions of the balance between the different fuels in our energy supply? And Kenneth Humphreys, what's your vision for it?
Well, I think one of the things when you think about the future is we all know that it's going to be influenced by a whole range of different factors, and there's a fair amount of uncertainty. But it's also important to reflect upon what's your point of departure. Where are we today? And certainly fossil fuels are the backbone of the global energy system, particularly with respect to electricity. In the U.S., coal is half of our electricity base. And in other countries, China, India, Australia, South Africa, plays a very important part. So as I look at a whole range of different policy scenarios that people have formulated, certainly I strongly envision that coal and gas will remain central to the backbone of the electricity system. Certainly renewables will increase in terms of their total gigawatts of penetration, but I think absent higher energy prices and some bold advances in energy storage and transmission to move power to markets, they have an important role to play, but one that is still fairly focused. I think nuclear, I'm actually fairly optimistic that we will resolve some of our challenges there, and as a low-carbon source, it will continue to play a big role. And of course, behind the scenes, the negawatts energy efficiency will be extremely important. But being a coal guy, I place a lot of faith in our ability to address coal's remaining issues and have it continue to be central to the power generation backbone of the world.
And that means, when you talk about remaining issues, that means coal with carbon capture and storage?
That, and also just in general, while coal, particularly in the U.S., is about 80% cleaner than it was in 1970, we still have some pressing issues to address, so we feel the pressure of new regulations related to hazardous air pollutants and the like, and so we will certainly have to address those. Carbon, it's likely we enter a carbon-constrained world, but how quickly does that come? And how deep the reductions are that are required are certainly going to require carbon capture and storage, not just on coal, but if we wish to meet some of the aggressive targets policymakers talk about, you'll need CCS on gas and industrial sources as well.
Thank you. Lady Doge.
Well, I tend to agree very much with my neighbor that coal and oil are still going to be a big part of the world's needs because they're there and they're necessary and they're baseload. I also think gas is very important. Didn't mention that. We did talk about gas this morning. Gas is becoming a real winner, as you were saying this morning, with shale gas as well as LNG. And I think gas is going to have an increasingly important part. I would say this, wouldn't I, but I do believe that nuclear is seriously going to be part of the mix. Whatever happens after Fukushima with respect to Europe and the countries that are changing their mind about nuclear, China, Russia, India, the developing world, are all continuing to build nuclear power plants, and I see that as a serious part of their energy mix. I'm a big fan of renewables, but I do think their challenges are stronger than we think, and that it's going to take a while to have this proper storage and proper transmission, and it's not base load, so that we're going to use them, but we're going to have to rely on nuclear and the base load sources for longer than we think, because although we want to use renewables, it's going to take a little while to get them to be the right price and the right technology.
Thank you. Milton Catlin?
Well, I don't think you're going to get a lot of disharmony on the question, on the answer, because I agree with the two previous speakers. You will have CCS at scale on coal and on gas, and it's needed on both coal and gas. You'll see nuclear re-enter the force in force. You'll see coal probably still at 40% of global electricity. You'll see a massive increase in renewables. And this is all because the energy pie, the energy consumption pie, is getting larger, demand is getting larger. And you'll also see us attending COP47, at which we'll all be discussing the crisis of climate change and the urgency of action to stabilise at 6 degrees centigrade.
Well, indeed, and that's an issue I want to explore a bit later because, as you say, that's potentially a not entirely reassuring prospect for certainly those of us who are planning to still be alive at that point. David Crane.
Well, my perspective is very much a U.S. perspective, and I would say just, I guess have a slightly different angle from my colleagues in that I think coal is going to lose market share in the United States because, whether you're an investor-owned utility or an independent power company like we are, there's just no gain to owning coal plants. I mean, because there's always that environmental risk. So maybe municipalities in the United States might build a few coal plants, but the coal fleet in the United States is very old, 38 years old on average, and I think it'll start to fade away. Nuclear, the Fukushima thing was as the company that was starting the first nuclear plant in the United States and just wrote off a $352 million investment. Maybe I'm a bit jaded, but I think nuclear, apart from a couple plants in the deep south of the United States, will not get built for another generation as a result of Fukushima. And I think nuclear becomes very much a developing world thing, as traditional coal, I think, will be a developing world thing. Renewables, I think the United States are in for a difficult period because of the Republican ascendancy. Unfortunately, renewables have become politicized in the United States and become seen as a creature of the Democratic Party. So the government support that's been there for the last few years won't be there when the Republicans get control of the Senate, which they'll get at the next election. And so the default fuel in the United States is natural gas. Everyone loves it. And the United States power industry will repeat the mistakes of 10 years ago when we built 200,000 megawatts of natural gas, causing the price of natural gas to go up by 500%. And so I think for the next 10 years, I think the United States is natural gas. And from a point of view of climate change, that means replacing coal with natural gas will be very helpful in terms of achieving the 2020 goal and devastatingly counterproductive in terms of achieving the 2050 goal. Because, you can't take the power sector, you can't cut carbon in half, you got to cut it to zero if you want to really make a difference. So anyway, that's my view.
Excellent. No, thank you very much. And I'm pleased to hear a bit of skepticism about natural gas because we've all been very much in one direction so far this morning. We've had a lot of very positive things and undoubtedly there's a lot to be said about the resource and about its potential and so on. But that's very interesting to hear you draw that analogy with the 90s, which was actually another period when there was a lot of talk about the abundance of natural gas and how this fantastic fuel was going to change the energy landscape. And I guess there is that saying about today's glut is tomorrow's shortage.
Look, I'm not an opponent of natural gas. I'm actually on the board of a natural gas company. I think the best thing the power industry, at least in the United States, has going for it is that it's multi-fuel. And when you sacrifice that, you sacrifice your single greatest advantage. And so that's what concerns me.
And as you say, we are at that point now, apparently in the US, where kind of everything is being ruled out for one reason or another, which
exactly.
is everything else. Did you see carbon capture as being clean coal in whatever form as being a saviour of the coal industry?
Well, I mean, to me, the fact that there could be a price on carbon in the United States is, again, it's at least 10 to 20 years away. So the only place you can make carbon capture work in the United States economically is when you're using clean coal for enhanced oil recovery. And we have a project with the Department of Energy to do just that in Texas, but that basically limits you for CCS to Texas and Louisiana and possibly Wyoming and things like that. So a few projects will get done, but I think CCS is very much, again, a product of the developing world. I don't think it will be done very much in the United States. People don't want tons and tons of carbon injected under their houses.
Right.
It doesn't matter how irrational that might be. They just don't want it.
Thank you, Kenneth. I'll let you come back to that in a moment. But first, Anonymous, what's your feeling on that longer-term perspective?
Well,
My first decision was to have the agency not do any scenarios, because I think there are too many. And since we're a public body, somebody's going to ask us why ours was so horribly wrong. But let's look at some of the trends. First, I think the discussion here is very Eurocentric or US Eurocentric. There's a bigger world out there, and there are big things going on. I think the first huge problem is one that we pointed at this morning, which is the immensely distorted market for energy we have globally. We had hoped, and you know, there had been a lot of interest from the French to engage us in a discussion as we prepared for the G20, because the whole issue of subsidies was going to be on the table. In 2008, you had $550 billion of subsidies for fossil fuels. Now, that was a Band-Aid, but when you need a Band-Aid that's $550 billion in price, it shows you there's something fundamentally wrong with the system you have. But I don't think yet there's a political will there to do that. We heard a lot about political elites this morning. I haven't heard that much about political elites since Sarah Palin entered the U.S. election. But the political elites I know, I don't know the ones you know, but the ones I know are pretty friendly with big coal and big oil. You know, which is why this issue is not being resolved on market distortion. Let's face it, it's a political issue, not an economic issue. That's one. The second is the climate change negotiation, and I've been following this for 15 years, foundered on the rocks of Copenhagen. Every meeting we've had since then has been delegates traveling around the world, locked in earnest discussions, which actually don't produce anything. Doesn't mean climate change is not happening. I know there are people here who don't believe that, but unfortunately I happen to believe in science and the evidence of my own eyes. And in my own country of Kenya, I can see the fundamental impact it's having on water availability, on land degradation. I mean, when I was a child, on a very clear day from my house, I could see the faint outlines of both Kilimanjaro and Mount Kenya, and you could see the snow caps. Today, we can neither see the mountains nor the snow caps. So I think there's something fundamentally wrong with our energy system, and I think the solution has to be a fairly radical one. And I think the political appetite to do that is not there. Now, big things are happening, and they're going to force changes. My organization has been in the preparatory process for 2 years. Within that period, over 150 governments have joined as members. We expect in the next year or two, we will have near universal membership. Why is this happening with the Renewable Energy Agency while the idea has been out there for decades? It's because there's an expectation that the developments we see today in technology, in cost, are coming to a point where this can potentially be a reality. Every day in your esteemed newspaper, we see announcements. Last week, the U.S. Energy Department, the IEA, announced that they have now innovation in the wafer technology for PVs, which is going to halve the cost of PVs from the halving the Chinese have already done through their R&D. That arrow which the gentleman from GE was showing us is pretty quick in the way it's moving. And that's not just PV. Wind, the new blade technology we see for wind, the new turbines that are under research and development are going to transform that. Now, what's happening in the rest of the world? I'm living in the Middle East, in the UAE. It's counterintuitive to think that they will be investing in renewable energy, but they are. Billions of dollars. Not only in UAE, where they are building one of the biggest concentrated solar plants, but in other European countries, and with investment comes access to technology. So it's not just that you're making money by putting a few billion in a company. That technology now belongs to you. These are not European or American entities that are now entering the marketplace. They see their future as an energy economy, not as an oil economy. And they're on a trajectory to get there. The demonstration effect in the region has been in Saudi Arabia. You see the establishment of King Abdullah City. In Qatar, they're looking at ambitious renewable targets. Others. This kind of investment is going to drive the innovation much quicker. Next week, Minister Peters from South Africa is here, who's been fighting valiantly on some of these issues. She has to provide energy to her people, at the same time see how she can decarbonize the mix. We're having 40 African ministers coming to Abu Dhabi to discuss, energy ministers, not environment ministers who are involved in the climate change debate, We're coming to discuss practical issues like finance. What's the policy framework? We know that there are big institutional investors out there and sovereign funds that are looking for emerging economies to invest in. The problem for Africa has been that after a lost decade in the 80s and 90s of growth, when we stagnated, we have consistent growth rates of 5, 6, 7% annually in sub-Saharan Africa. The current exposure to energy insecurity, volatility of prices and supply issues is knocking 2 or 3% of that growth every year. They need a solution to this. Africa is going to invest in renewable energy. The Middle East is investing. Asia is there. So I think there are some transformative things going on which are going to drive these processes much quicker.
So we heard the figure quoted this morning that I think renewables, excluding hydropower, is about, whatever it is, 1.5% of global primary energy supply. What is it in 2030 or 2050?
Look, I mean, if we selectively quote figures out of context, they're going to tell you all sorts of things. And I can tell you about installed capacity last year, which was at a record level. I can tell you about rates of growth in installed capacity, about renewables, which are, 60, 70% on an annual basis. It's a question of where's the trajectory going. And I think that we're going to be, I think nobody is naive enough to say it's going to be 100% renewables anytime soon. But I think with the new technology of smart grids, integrated solutions, we're going to have a share of renewables that I see in close to half of the energy mix globally.
Anyone care to respond to that? Any thoughts?
I think that would be devoutly to be wished, but it seems unlikely globally. I agree with you that this has been a very European and American conversation, and that the developing world is where a lot of action is. It's interesting to me that the one power plant that went exactly on without missing a beat, nuclear power plant, was in Abu Dhabi. So Abu Dhabi is not just in renewables. They're building nuclear power plants. They're building Masdar City, which is the renewable center, and they're looking at their energy mix because they have an enlightened leadership. I would like to say, and I don't want to argue about renewables, I just think 50% is quite a high number. I think the developing world is going to be where the energy mix is going to change, and that we hope that coal will be reduced a bit because of its problems in the environment. We hope CCS will work. But whatever it is, I think we have to look to India, China, Russia, the developing world in Southeast Asia, if we talk about the big percentages of what's going to happen in the world, because that's where the industrial action is going to be. So that's where the energy action is going to be.
Milton Catlin.
Sorry, I just think if you're hoping coal will decline, I think you're hoping the wrong thing. The BP Statistical Review for 2010 pointed out that the growth in coal in that year was 7.6%. Growth in nuclear was 2%. Coal's share of global energy consumption was 29 or 30%. That's the highest figure it's had as a share of global consumption since 1970. So, and I'm not trying to wash away environmental concerns. Coal producers know that there are emissions from the use of coal. They've responded to that in terms of NOx pollutants, SOx, particulates, and they'll respond in terms of CO2 pollutants.
And actually, I don't know for anyone who was here watching Steve Bowles' presentation just before coffee, if you noticed his slide of investment in new generation capacity over the next 10 years, the single largest fuel there was coal. Coal was, I can't remember the number, but it was more than 25%. It was about 29%.
I totally agree with that.
Gas was number 2, then wind was 3.
I think we need coal. I think I said when we started out, we need coal because we need baseload generation. I was really talking about the renewable number that I didn't think was that high. I think fossil fuels are going to be with us, and we're going to have to deal with them.
Well, so question then, what are the climate implications of that? I mean, that's, you made your slightly flippant remark about 6 degrees of warming, but that potentially is what we're looking for. And I was listening to what people were saying earlier this morning. I was very struck by Nobuo Tanaka's comment about 450 parts per million is that's gone basically. We should give up on that. That's it's highly unlikely we're going to get to that. And again, as Jonathan Holt was saying, the science is uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen. It's all modelling and whatever. You can't necessarily be certain of this, but at least the risk must be there, and that must be profoundly worrying, is it not?
I think it's profoundly worrying. Also, I did make a flippant remark about 6%. I think if you speak to people from the US delegation, the Australian delegation, from anybody who's informed in this field, they know that we've missed stabilisation at 2 degrees this century. That's missed. The problem is no national government is going to say that or be the first to say that. So that's the problem we're in. The other problem we're in is if you look at some of those graphs that were shown by the previous speaker, the one about the what do you need to do to get abatement at 2 degrees. If you were getting 2 degrees, what it says is that 20% of the effort comes from renewables, and it says 20% comes from CCS. Yeah. So the central question to ask is, if those figures are correct, how much are governments investing in renewables, and how much are they investing in CCS? If a government has £10 to spend and it's serious about climate change, why is it putting 8 of those pounds into renewables and ignoring nuclear and ignoring CCS?
I think because renewables make you feel good.
Exactly.
I think renewables make people feel good. They make governments feel good. They take a lot of the heat, with respect, out of the energy debate by putting your money into renewables. I think they're exactly right. They need to put money into carbon capture. They need to put money into nuclear. They need to do things that are base load before they deal, or at least as well as dealing with top-up energy.
And then, I mean,
gas is a base load option, but the question I'd like to know, if we've missed 450 ppm and we're looking at accelerated trends of climate change, you won't have a market for your coal and oil. There are not going to be people around to consume it.
Look, this is.
I think we've so got out of the climate change discussion by making it a technical issue that we're discussing without looking at what are really the implications going to be for people. It is basically the poor in the developing world who are paying the externalized costs of your energy use. And I think that, there needs to be a very conscious political policy to try to give the same incentives to renewables development, and we see the technology changing and we see the costs coming down, that we have done to conventional energy sources. And I think that there needs to be a political frame that needs to be created for that discussion.
This is classic fear-mongering. Honestly, the level of subsidies for fossil fuels, if you look at the IEA statistics, will tell you 99% of subsidies of fossil fuels are in oil and gas. And of that, the lion's share, the largest lion's share, it's the wrong phrase, the largest share of that is in Iran. Now, this is absolute red herring or a furphy in Australian terms. And if you want to talk about how it affects people, essentially, I don't think the renewables message will get many votes in countries where they're looking at the West saying to them, our solution for you includes giving a light bulb to a village. That's not a sustainable economic development solution.
No, absolutely not.
So, David Crane, I just wanted to bring you on from a US perspective. How do you see this question of subsidies and whether renewables are subsidised more than fossil fuels? I mean, imagine, because it's an issue that's sometimes talked about in the US. People say, let's scrap all subsidies. You've got to get rid of everything. Get rid of all the subsidies for fossil fuels and for renewables. Let everything kind of compete on a level playing field.
It's
what would then happen?
That you asked that question, because I've actually been traveling around Europe, and I was, even as someone who's a true believer on the climate change front, I was struck by how much in Europe everyone believes, there's consensus on it, and it forms the basis for everything. And there's a view that government policy can affect a positive outcome to the crisis. And none of this is relevant to the United States. This is just not. I mean, it's like people in Europe are talking a completely different language. I mean, the subsidies to fossil fuel. I mean, I actually came into England through Portsmouth because some of my kids wanted to see the British Navy, and there was a British aircraft carrier sitting there. And my 12-year-old son asked me, how many aircraft carriers do the British have? And I said, well, I think that's the only one. And I said to him, son, the reason that the United States Navy is bigger than the next 14 navies, in the world is because they're protecting the sea lanes. And the U.S. Navy spends $80 billion a year. That's a subsidy for fossil fuels. The United States Navy exists for fossil fuels. It has no other purpose And so, but I mean, you try and get someone in the United States on the right side of the political spectrum to say, hey, you know, that's a subsidy to the oil industry. You know, they just look at you like you're mad. So the subsidies for the fossil fuels in the United States, which exist, they're not going anyplace. So you can't beat the oil companies in Congress on that. Just leave them alone. It's not even worth discussing. You know, for me, the whole thing in the United States is that we had our best chance in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, and it went disastrously wrong. And renewables, green, which it's just none of it's working in the United States. The only thing that can possibly work in the United States is to get to the American public, the consumers, to demand it. And that depends, I think, totally on Carlos Ghosn and the electric car. Because the electric car, and you got to change from renewables to talking about sustainability, and the electric car, you know, defies every aspect of what green means in the United States. The electric car is fun. You know, it's cheaper to operate, if the American people and all Americans want to stop transferring American wealth to the Middle East, and so if we can use the electric car, that's our way back in the game. And what really drives me crazy is when people in the American power industry, the previous speaker spoke about this not in the same way that I go crazy, but you know, there are people in the American power industry that complain about the electric car and how it'll affect the stability of the grid. I'm like, are you crazy? This is the best thing to happen to our industry since the air conditioner. So.
And it has an air conditioner.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, not very fuel efficient. Energy efficient. But
and you can't run it if you want to keep driving, of course.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
So I always say, whenever I come across green-minded people, you want to do something in the United States, go buy a Nissan Leaf, go buy a Chevy Volt. You know, make the electric car a success, because if the electric car goes the way of the electric car experiment in California in the 1990s, then I don't see any hope for anything.
Yeah. Although, of course, the point that people often make is that actually, if you're using an old coal plant to generate the electricity that goes into that car, I mean, it's no in carbon terms, it's no.
You know, most America. I had like sometimes happens probably to people in a lot of countries. One time in my life, I was in a meeting with 18 other power company executives and President Obama, and I said, and he was trying to get us to do something about climate change, and I'm just like, I don't think so. I don't think it's going to happen. and I said, we sell the one product that law-abiding Americans steal every day. He goes, well, what are you talking about? I said, you go in the airport and people are just finding a plug and they're plugging in their computer. I said, someone's got to pay for the electricity. And Obama said to me, I used to do that. I don't go through airports very much anymore, but I used to do that. I said, see, you're a stealer of electricity, and we elected you president of the United States. It's just like, it's crazy. But so I think that you're right that people in the United States only think about energy when they're at the gas pump. And if they buy an electric car, they start to think about where their energy's come for the house. Now, you know as well as I do that even electricity from a dirty coal plant run through an electric car is 30% better than tailpipe emissions.
I didn't know that. I've not seen that number, right.
Well, and that's because the fundamental fact that the reason running an electric car is so cheap is that electric motors are 80% efficient, while internal combustion engines are 25% efficient. So that's why the numbers work even for a dirty coal plant. So I mean, that's the thing. Electric cars, except for the initial purchase price of the car, you win every argument, with electric cars. And so that's what we would like to push and get the American people to. So we're all for Carlos Ghosn. He's my hero.
May I just say that I think there's no future in political negotiations to resolve climate change, unfortunately. There are a number of big emitters that are just not able to commit to something like that. The way to deal with it is through the practical innovation and supporting the trends that we see. The transportation issue is going to be crucial to this. If you can take carbon out of the transportation equation in the US, that's a huge win for climate change. If we can look at where are the solutions. I liked very much the GE presentation talking about gas baseload and increasing renewables. We have other options, if we look at the regional integration of grids. We just have a $700 million investment in wind in northern Kenya, which required a lot of infrastructure to be built around that, which is going to really feed into the Kenyan grid. The issue there is that this can be integrated into the regional grid with the hydro in Uganda, where hydro can become the storage capacity, where wind is meeting the capacity required at any particular peak load. So there are many solutions to this. The question is, how do we incentivize those solutions rather than deal with political gridlock in negotiations?
Should we take some questions from the floor? Actually, I'm conscious we're running a little short of time, but it'd be great to get a few questions or contributions from the floor. Yes, one over there, back left. Back of our left.
Looking historically, the debate reminds me very much of the debate in Britain in the 1930s. Of course, the majority were for appeasement, and only a minority was looking forward and realizing the dangers we're facing. But I mean, to hold out coal as a future, when even in Texas you can't get licenses for new coal plants. I mean, the number of U.S. plants licenses which have been cancelled over the past couple of years shows there's certainly no future for it in the U.S. And the rest of the world is beginning to realize that that's not the case. Now, as far as nuclear goes, apart from all the known dangers, you have global terrorism, you also have the fact that climate change is not just something which is going to affect us somewhere in the future. It also affects your energy options. In France, the last hot summer in 2003, you had to close down 58 nuclear power plants because of the lack of cooling water. So for that reason alone, nuclear is no option. And if you want to go the oil and gas route until the planet fries, then as was said before, you're not just losing the planet, you're of course also losing your customers. So it's quite clear that a major shift to renewables is both possible. I mean, we've seen it when the political will was there. If Roosevelt had thought like you did, then the Nazis would have invaded, and Churchill would have lost the war. So I do suggest a bit more leadership and a bit less fatalism.
Thank you.
Leadership comes in different forms, and I think that one of the things I'm suggesting is there are large energy companies. Certainly, I work with 10 of them that are co-funding the effort that we're putting forward to build what we hope to be the world's first near-zero emission coal plant that uses saline reservoirs. We're doing that on an international basis because we believe that's an effective route to quickly get the technology deployed around the world, not just be U.S.-centric. I think there you have a set of companies who are saying we have an abundant, affordable resource base, not just in the U.S., but around the world in coal. We realize we have environmental challenges, and technology is one of the ways that we can fundamentally deal with those challenges. And if we're successful, we drive down the costs, and ultimately the marketplace can decide among a variety of different low-carbon choices. Personally, I think it's going to be a portfolio of technologies at the end of the day, not one. It won't just be coal, and it won't just be renewables. It'll be a portfolio.
Thank you. Lady Judge, you wanted to go in?
Well, I actually think that there's been a lot of leadership around renewables. I think renewables wouldn't have ever gotten to where they are if the political leaders of today hadn't embraced them. I think it's quite interesting that in the UK, where we are having a very difficult time with our budgetary constraints, there's still money ring-fenced for renewables. So, and a real effort. I know Chris Yoon is speaking later about that. So I rather disagree with this man in the back that we don't have leadership around renewables. I think the leadership today is looking at the energy choices, and rather like my neighbor, there's a lot of leadership around an energy portfolio. I rather think we need a bouquet of energy sources. We need coal, we need gas, we need renewables, we need nuclear, we need them all. This isn't a zero-sum game, which is what some people say. We need more energy all the time to fuel the world, and we can't throw any of them off the table.
David.
Well, I think there are a few things that the question, well, I actually didn't hear a question, but that he said that are inaccurate. The first is that actually Texas has permitted several coal plants, and I know that because we have a permit to build a new coal plant in Texas, which we're not building, and we've held this permit for 4 years. We have built
and the reason you're not building it is?
Well, the price of power doesn't support building actually anything, but it certainly doesn't support building a coal plant where in natural gas is showing up under every rock. But But we have built 4 wind farms since we've had the permit. We're also on track for building. We just announced a $2.5 billion solar PV on 800 megawatts on 100 different warehouse rooftops around the United States, and we've got 1,500 megawatts of solar in the California and Arizona desert. We're also building an electric vehicle charging network at our expense in Houston and Dallas-Fort Worth, which would make Texas, the home of oil, the leader of electric car. So, I reject totally the concept that there's no leadership in this area. And I say, but, we tend to talk on this panel about government policy. In the United States, it's all free market. And renewables might be, a tiny part of the equation and insignificant in the scheme of macro policy on the global level, which all may be true. But at least in the United States, it's the one true growth area. And since our company wants to grow, we're hitting it all very aggressively. But there's a difference between a company doing it out of self-interest and it being a national policy. And the fact is, the United States, with natural gas prices being so low, without a strong thumb of the government on the energy mix, 20 years from now, the situation in the United States in terms of what's producing power is going to look very much like it does today. Because with low natural gas prices in the United States, you can't actually afford to build anything new. You can't even afford to build new natural gas, plants, because the wholesale price of power just doesn't support anything being built, unless there's a market mandate like for renewables.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. I'm afraid, sorry, I can see some more hands up. I'm afraid we are going to have to end here because we've come to the end of our time for the morning session, but hopefully you'll be able to continue the discussion again over lunch. But for now, Adnan Amin, David Crane, Milton Catlin, Lady Barbara Judge, and Kenneth Humphreys, thank you all very much indeed. Thanks a lot.